Buenos días a todos. My name is Karen Vega, and I'm joined by my colleague here, Shivani Gorle. Together, we're representing the media and entertainment sector. Specifically, we work for Paramount Global in our advertising division. And today, we're going to present some findings from our study called Industry in Progress, which is really a continuation of research that we've done as a company around on-screen representation and the progress that the ad industry, more specifically, has made and needs to make when it comes to Hispanic representation in advertising. On to last year, actually, just a little anecdote. I had the pleasure of attending my first Hispanic Leadership Summit, and Claudia so graciously gave me the stage to discuss with a panel of colleagues around representation in media. That conference really left me inspired and really wanting to take action. And so I called up Claudia, I called up the We're All Human team, connected internally with my colleagues, and I said, we need to do something for next year. We need to research and take a pulse on what is happening in advertising and how we are showing up. And so what you'll see today is a snippet of that labor of love of a year's worth of work that we so graciously did in partnership with Claudia and We Are All Human. So when we embarked on this study, we had a couple of goals, right? We want to make sure that we increase representation in advertising. We want to be able to provide more nuanced and authentic portrayals of Hispanics. This is important. And then also what we want to do is internally for our industries, we want to show true business impact. But lastly, how do we do it? How do we have the tools to do it, which Claudia also mentions, right? We want to empower marketers, advertisers, anyone in this industry to be able to be a change maker. And so you'll get to see a little bit of what we created in terms of an actual framework. Next slide, please. So we recognize, right, there's great responsibility that we have as a media company, as Paramount, and when it comes to accuracy and portrayals. We know that igniting systemic change is through diverse storytelling, through representation of diverse audiences, both in front of and behind the camera, right? This means we have to change the whole entire content creation ecosystem itself. And this is what our company's initiative, Content for Change, is about. And this research supports that initiative. As you see, our EVP of Social Impact and ESG, Crystal Barnes, she states that when you intentionally create spaces and pipelines for inclusive storytelling, it shifts perception, and it's a catalyst for what transformative and equitable content can look like in the future. So for us at Paramount, once this approach becomes the industry standard and it's quantified, it is really then that we'll be able to see meaningful change that can impact generations and culture itself. So it's an obvious question. Why does representation matter in media? Well, because 85% of consumers agree that the way that people are portrayed in entertainment influences perceptions of them in the real world. Just take a pause and think back to when you first saw yourself represented in media, right? How did that make you feel? Viola Davis talks about this powerful effect in that representation had on her. And she says, there is something about seeing someone that, when you see them on the big screen, that makes it more tangible, right? It's a physical manifestation of your dreams. And so the powerful effect of representation doesn't just stop with entertainment, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is equally important in advertising, according to 73% of consumers. And representation in advertising is, as we see it, more complicated now than ever. Next slide, please. This is a scene, as you're seeing here, from the I'd Like to Buy a World Coke campaign back in 1971. This may just be the earliest form and example of inclusive advertising. And perhaps it worked well at a time when any kind of visibility of marginalized identity was powerful. But the reality is that this United Colors of Benetton version of diversity feels a little antiquated. And so consumer expectations are calling for inclusive portrayals. And as those expectations grow, brands are really fearful of getting it wrong. If you're a brand practitioner or marketer, you know this. Today, consumer boycotts, backlashes have become more frequent, more intense. There's a polarized climate, which means brands are really worried about getting it wrong and also just sparking any kind of culture war conversation. So it's really clear that the landscape of diversity and inclusion has shifted dramatically, and these brands now have to exist in a more tense environment. So with this study that we'll show you, we really wanted to take a stock of the current landscape to see how far has the industry come in terms of representation and portrayals, and also the state of DEI in the advertising industry. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Shivani to take you through some of that.
Thank you, Karen. So we wanted to be very intentional with the methodology approach, right? So like we are all human, we care about supporting advocacy for this community with hard data, and we conducted a nationally representative survey amongst 3,600 consumers, an extensive qualitative phase where we conducted in-depth interviews, mobile ethnographies, and not only did we talk to consumers, we wanted to understand our challenges as an industry, and so we surveyed ad industry professionals and interviewed them both on the media side and the brand side across creative and media agencies. And a few more unconventional research techniques such as the semiotics of representation and using horizon scanning, cultural forces that affect how we think about DE&I. And in the larger study, we typically walk through these 6 chapters, and the purpose of this is to educate and inform our internal teams as well as external clients about the landscape and these audiences. So whether it's unpacking the state of DE&I to understanding how the industry is a work in progress when it comes to representation, to evolving portrayals in Representation 2.0, understanding the ROI on inclusion, as Karen mentioned, and coming up with actions as part of this toolkit, and then finally not forgetting the kind of inclusion initiatives that are happening at Paramount and what we are doing about the issue. So we'll start by focusing on the diversity of the ads being created on the next slide. And we looked at progress before, during, and after the height of the pandemic. So you'll see on the next slide that the events of 2020 drove an increase in representation across race and ethnicity. So rose significantly across Black, Asian, and Hispanic groups from 2019 to 2020, and it rose the most for Hispanic representation to nearly 12% in 2020. But we are also seeing a pullback on that progress over the next 2 years. So from 2021 to 2022, on the next slide, you'll see marginalized representation decreased across all groups. And as that was happening, we also noticed an increase in representation for white people, which jumped to 73% in 2022. And this year's Super Bowl was yet another signal of the industry's waning commitment to representation, where a lot of the ads starred predominantly white men. And perhaps the most striking insight here is that the Hispanic representation saw the sharpest decline, with the current representation lower than pre-pandemic levels and down from its highest point in 2020. And that is surprising, as we all know and we've heard since yesterday. The Hispanic community is a priority target for brands, and they have significant purchasing power. They also happen to be the largest ethnic community in the US, and their representation is the most disproportionate when you compare it to their actual population size. So only having a 5% presence in ads, despite being nearly 20% of the US population. And when you look at the numbers for white specifically, on the flip side, there is more representation in ads for the white community than their total population overall. This should give us pause as an industry. Inclusion is clearly taking a hit when you look at the quantity of representation. And when you look at the quality and how these identities are being portrayed, we want to think about how we can evolve them to match consumer expectations, because the only thing worse than not being represented is being misrepresented. And this is something we heard from one of our respondents we spoke to. It's a sentiment shared by nearly all the people we interviewed. Because negative stereotypes, they really impact how people are seen by society. And in our survey on the next slide, we asked people to rank the top stereotypes that are perpetuated against certain communities in advertising. And one dominant trope that we wanted to call out was that Hispanic people are often stereotyped as poor, lazy, and victims. And there is also this TikTok video from the creator, Brittany Garcia Dumas, who will talk about just this, if we can figure out how to play the video. And if we can't, that's
We
fine
talk
too.
about how Latinos are represented in marketing. How come every Latino has to be like dancing or like with the chihuahua or something? Like, do y'all think I just like bachata my way like everywhere I go? How come it's never just like, here are 3 homeowners and one of them is Latino? Here are 3 business owners and one of them is Latino. Here are 3 mothers. One of them is Latino. Because you know that's the truth, right? Did you know that 30% of Gen Z in America are Latino? A whole third. So why is it that we're still like, why does every woman have to be a Fanta woman? You know what I'm saying? They're getting us. And they're showing us what they think of us in their marketing. So maybe we make a change.
There are many more consumers out there, like Brittany. And advertisers don't know this, but consumers are more aware than advertisers think, and they want them to do better. And Anahi, who is 34 and Latina, also says, taking some effort to talk to a group to better portray them should be pocket change. Companies need to do some research. That's all they need to do. And so consumers know that brands have their intentions in the right places, but not necessarily the right resources. And so to talk about that, we'll have Karen.
Yeah, so right, there is a moral imperative to representation in advertising because of the power and influence it has, but it also just needs to be seen as a business imperative because there is significant ROI. So next slide, one shift that has changed the way we think about inclusive advertising is that the racial reckoning really forced brands to pledge their commitment to racial justice through sort of these black box ads that support Black Lives Matter or support CSR initiatives for other communities of color. And what this did is it conflated inclusive advertising with social responsibility. More than half of ad industry professionals believe that if their company increased diversity in advertising, they were doing it to be socially responsible than for business impact. So if you were here yesterday, and as you saw also Claudia mentioned it earlier this morning in the Hispanic sentiment study, it showed that 29% of Hispanic consumers feel that their values are not being shared and reflected by big brands, right? This tells us the Hispanic community feels invisible, and that's true for advertising. They feel excluded from the narrative and disregarded by big brands. And really, brands can't afford to let this community feel invisible. And as Shivani mentioned, Hispanic consumers notice when they are represented, which is important in a time when brands are competing for attention and that brand recall, right? 65% of Hispanic consumers notice brands that feature people like them in their advertising, which is significantly more than 62% than all consumers. One consumer we spoke to in our research, his name is Adalji, a 31-year-old Latino from Baja California. He recalled a Dove commercial because of one of the actors had the same skin condition as one of his cousins, and his cousin really expressed how she felt seen and understood and reflected. And his call to action is to make media really tell the real stories, tell the relatable stories. And getting inclusion right pays off in a big way. Again, another hard-hitting stat that we saw in the Hispanic sentiment study, 83% felt more favorable towards a brand if it played a positive role in their life, and 84% would be more likely to be a customer of the brand. This is ROI, guys. So clearly, inclusivity is not just socially responsible, it's fiscally responsible. And so, for all of us who may be in this room, who we have to report up to the C-suite, we have to answer the question of why do we need to care about the Hispanic target? The answer is that the cost of inaction is too high. And especially when you consider that 52% of consumers will avoid, Hispanic consumers will avoid using your brand if it's not being genuine in the way that you're portraying them. And 42% will think less of a brand that doesn't represent people like them. So this is your proof right here. This is where you can show that the money is being left on the table. Please take note of this. And so perhaps the ultimate benefit of inclusive advertising is this halo effect it creates, which means that inclusive advertising really just resonates with audiences beyond that diverse target. So ad that can be intended for Latinos can actually work just as well for other communities. And so now that we've been through the state of representation and portrayal for advertising and why it's good for business and for all of us, the question is, how do we do this? And this is what Shivani will take you through, which is the toolkit, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We'll breeze through these next few bits, but we've been through the state of representation, and we know that this is good for business, and now the question is, how do you get it right? And content for change became our starting point and our inspiration, so we just wanted to put the same amount of rigor that we put behind transforming content at Paramount. So on the next slide, you'll see that we wanted to increase diversity across these three pillars of content, creative supply chain, and culture, and those pillars informed eventually the toolkit that we wanted to build. So we know that professionals need to be set up for success. On the next slide, we have some stats around the complexity that we were hearing about that goes into inclusive storytelling. People just want guidance. They want tools to facilitate better representation in advertising. They're finding it hard to talk about this subject, and we know that there was a gap to fill. So we created this toolkit on the next slide that acts as a framework. So here are 6 steps to get you started, and I know everyone here, it comes from a range of different professions and fields and knowledge, but this framework isn't just for marketers, it's for anyone who cares about championing this community, bringing more visibility. So whether it's doing the inclusivity audit or making the research and insights process more empathy forward, or championing these narratives in broader mainstream media, or having a response plan for when you finally become a part of the cultural dialogue. So lots more where that came from. On the next slide, we have a QR code. If you're interested in learning more about the study, this is a quick overview, but we typically take a full hour, and Karen and I, again, we're thrilled and honored to bring industry and progress to this forum, and incredibly proud. So thank you for the time.